Christy. How are you?
Good. How are you, Erin? It's nice to see you virtually.
I know. I wish it was in person, but
Me too. I wish I could just give you a big hug.
I agree. I'm so honored to be doing this. Thank you so much for asking me. It's really
thank you for doing it.
Yeah. I absolutely loved this book, and I cannot wait to talk to you about it and kind of find out all the behind the scenes information and all of that sort of thing. So
that's great. Well, and I love your books too.
Well, you're so sweet.
So, I was an early discoverer of your work.
You much. So I'm really curious after reading this book, kind of the age-old question of all books, right? How did this come to be? But also, it's set on Cape Cod, which is not near Wisconsin, and a different culture from in Wisconsin, and it kind of blends Wisconsin with Cape Cod and connects it. But I'm just really, really curious about how this book started. What was the impetus for it?
Oh, great. Thanks. Well, so every time I answer this question, I realize the roots of the story were actually in a different place than I thought. So initially, I used to say that the novel started when I was in Panama with my mom about a decade ago. And I met a woman who worked at a resort there, and she was a bartender and surfer. And she made this comment that hit me funny when she said she never, ever went home. And I, maybe also as a mom, that was hard for me to think about. And I also had a friend who would tell me that the only place he ever felt at home was on an airplane. And so that bothered me. I wanted to bring her home. I thought that would be nice to give her a reason to return home. So I started thinking about writing a story about how would I get her home. So the Poppy character is kind of based loosely on this bartender / surfer, but she really became her own person as I wrote her. So that's originally what I would say was the beginning of the story, but I think it goes further back than that. When my grandparents, who had a house in Cape Cod that they retired to, it's been in our family since the 1890s, and we spent our summers there every year, and I loved going to Cape Cod. It was always the best part of summer. I remember counting down the days when we were there, thinking, oh no, we only have 11 days left. We only have 8 days left. We only have 4 days left. And then the night before we had to leave to go back home, I just, want to hold on to the house as hard as I could and stay forever. But when my grandparents passed away, they died only 4 days apart in the same home that my great-grandparents died in 4 days apart a couple of generations ago, which is, so now I know how my husband and I are going to pass away. But anyway, they, because it was so sudden that they both died so close to each other, my mom and her sisters, who got along, but they had to figure out what to do with the house. And my mom technically had the first right of refusal on the property, but we were from Milwaukee, and my mom was a single mom. We didn't have much money at all, and she could hardly keep track of her own house, much less trying to deal with a house on another coast. So my Aunt Mel ended up getting the house, which was so great. I was so happy that it could stay in the family. But I think what really drove the novel was this tremendous fear I had at the time of the house falling into the wrong hands. I couldn't even imagine other people living there. And then also when they live there, it becomes off limits to you. Mm-hmm. And I didn't like the idea of never being able to go back to this house that I knew so intimately. I knew every corner of that house. So I think that's probably where the story came from, because once I started thinking about bringing that character back home, what was home, and for me, I had my house in Milwaukee, but I also really think of Wellfleet as a place that feels like home.
Mm-hmm. And is the house still in your family?
It is, yeah. My aunt owns it, and I'm so happy about that. And she and my uncle usually spend the off season there, and I've become a huge lover of the off season myself. I like it. It's less crowded, less tourists, and we really enjoy our time there.
So you still go regularly?
Yeah, as much as I can.
That's wonderful. That's really
great. It's a little easier now that my kids are grown.
I bet.
And they're busy. I think that's a problem that with people, I'm sure a lot of people in Wisconsin who have cottages and cabins, they can relate to this. You buy them so you have a place to experience leisure with your family, but then you hardly have any time to go to them because kids are so busy. It's so interesting with this COVID situation to think about how that's going to affect summer homes. And I just saw an article in the New York Times yesterday, and they said that long-term rentals are on the upswing and in these vacation communities because people can work from anywhere. So it's a really rare opportunity to spend the summer in a great place. But I wonder how that'll change these communities. It'll be more like actually when I was a kid, when people would spend all summer on the Cape instead of going week by week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like you said, people are untethered because of work, and I think also because of kids' activities, right? My kids, I can speak. I have young kids, 6 and 8, and their whole diving season was just canceled. Their soccer season was just canceled, and so we're pretty untethered as well. We usually go back and forth to the UP and to where my parents are, and now we can go up there for a month if we want to. So
yeah, it's both terrifying and a gift.
Right. Yes, double-edged sword for sure.
Exactly.
So I'm also curious about your, not just how this book started kind of from an idea standpoint, but how it started for you. You write these beautiful short fiction pieces, which I've been a fan of for years. And, you know, I just taught a short fiction class to my university students, and short fiction is such the short story form it's not just like a short novel. It's a completely different thing. How did you make that switch? And did you kind of choose to make that switch, or did you try to write the story as a short story and it took on a life of its own? How did that come to be?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because there was a time in my life where I was only writing short fiction. And I was so fascinated with authors of novels in longer form, thinking like, how did they do that? And I mean, first of all, I'll just say, like, I started out like a lot of beginning writers writing short fiction. It's such a great place to hone your skill, to learn how to put everything into play: characters, setting, plot, dialogue, the whole work. So that's why I think people like us who teach, it's such a great form to teach. And I love the craftiness of it. Mm-hmm. And I love when you finish a short story, how you can make it so tight. You know, you can work on it to death, and then it reaches a point where it is complete and it's done. And I just couldn't imagine writing a longer form, writing a novel. So I wanted to, though, because I think some of it was, professional. I felt like as a writer, I even though I'd published short stories in some great magazines, I felt like people acted like, well, when are you going to have a book? And it was such a persistent question. And I felt like I wasn't a real writer until I had a book. So when I got my PhD for my thesis, I had to write a novel. And I wrote a terrible novel. It's in a drawer right now. It had absolutely no plot. I really struggled with it. And then I decided to work on a novel set in a place that I loved instead of a place I didn't love, which I think freed me a little bit. So I started working on this. And I think in a way it's like a short story, because I go from character to character. So each character's arc is kind of its own kind of tighter thing. But I didn't know what to do with it. I really would lie in bed at night and think about all the plot elements that I'd put into play and wonder how they're ever going to resolve, and what am I going to do with this? It caused me so much pain, the decision-making process. And then I met a woman who became my writing partner, and she wrote for television. She was a reality television producer. So she produced like The Bachelor and stuff. So, which I love The Bachelor. But she taught me how I would send her chapters, and she would say, what are you supposed to do with this chapter? Like, what do you want this chapter to actually accomplish as far as moving your narrative forward? And it was such a simple suggestion, but it was so helpful to make me think about pushing the story forward and turning it into a bigger piece that had an arc, that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and how each chapter is like its own little part of the engine. And so once I started doing that, I'd exchange the chapters with her, and then I could start seeing how I could knit them together. And then that was the first draft, and it felt pretty good. But then going through and editing, once I had the whole draft, then I could see the whole, I knew the characters better. I told the story to myself, and then I started writing it again to tell it to readers. And it was so much easier the second time, or not really easier, but it was so much more fun, because I didn't have to make all those decisions. I knew what was going to happen, but I had to change the order of telling a little bit. And originally each of the chapters was out of chronology. I wanted to go back and forth in time. And it just seemed kind of pretentious, like it was just me trying to be writerly as opposed to thinking about what would make the story most satisfying for the reader. So I changed the order of it. And that's how I got to the longer form of a novel. And then I just wrote my second novel. In fact, 2 days ago, I got an email from my editor saying it's in production, which is such a great feeling. And that was so much easier. I'm not saying it was easy. It was still really hard. But having gone through writing a longer piece, I was able to really use some of what I learned the first time around to write a second book and think about, to me, the best thing a reader can tell me is I couldn't put this book down. Mm-hmm. And I never thought I'd get to that stage, but a lot of people are telling me that they just kind of turn the pages, and that makes me feel so good.
I agree. That's the experience I had with it. I could not wait to kind of just see how these timelines, I mean, it's two things. Like, I could not wait to see how all these different characters sort of came together and how their stories joined up. And I also, just really was so immersed in this world. And that's my favorite thing. Like, I want to lose, when I was younger and I was an avid reader, and I would just lose myself to the point of not being able to, hear someone when they were calling my name. And I definitely had that experience here. Like, I was in Wellfleet, I was in this area of Milwaukee, and it just felt so real to me. So,
oh, that's great.
You did your job. You did your job. Great. I also love what you just said, though, too, about as a writer, you tell I'm going to remember this and write it down, because you tell the story to yourself first, and then you figure out how to tell it to a reader. I love that idea. It's so,
yeah, it's super important, I think. It's very helpful.
Absolutely. So,
and some people more naturally are aware of their reader. I think some people just naturally, like, that uncle who comes to Thanksgiving who always has the best stories. They just know how to tell a story, and it's so easy for them. Or Frank McCourt, they have a very natural ability to do that. And for me, I think I just need a little more time.
I feel like we all as writers have our strengths, and then we have our things that, are a little bit more difficult for us. So, yeah. So this cover for the second home is it's beautiful. It's this, pastel, sort of soft, it's just a gorgeous cover. And it's, like I said, it's pastels and soft, and it's got a beach and people playing in the waves, and people think of Cape Cod and they think Kennedy's, and, so there's that perception of the book. And then there's the issues that it actually deals with. It really deals with some kind of grittier events and questions, and a couple of characters acting really badly. Why did you think it was important to kind of distinguish maybe between those two things? It's kind of like the nostalgia and the summer atmosphere, and then this like grittier side to the story. What do you make of that? What do you think readers should make of that?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that the cover hints at this sense of nostalgia, that the book is about a time, I actually love that time of day that it seems like it captures, like that kind of early evening when the light's really golden. So I responded to that right away, and I hope readers are connecting to that when they look at the cover. And really the book is about this ache of nostalgia that the characters have. But you're right. I think that some people have said that they look at the cover and they see that there's a hint of trouble in the cover. If you look at the figure that looks like it's Anne, like she's kind of off to the distance and kind of cut into two pieces, and you kind of get a sense that she's the character that something bad is going to happen to, or maybe I just know that because that's how I see it. But the book is definitely, when I wrote it, I wasn't thinking I'm going to write a beach read at all. In fact, the idea of it being a beach read is kind of interesting. And I think even now that it's being marketed, I'm not seeing it so much in all the beach read lists, because I think that it's not necessarily something that people would read for a lighter read. I think it definitely has a little more emotional heft, because it's very much about loss, loss of innocence, loss of childhood, the loss of a generation. And so there's definitely more grit to the book. And the cover, but I don't know, maybe it's better that that people might pick it up thinking that it might be a lighter read, and then hopefully I can ease them into these like more negative things that happen without them feeling like it's alarming, because it's not a totally dark book. There's still some humor, and there's a lot of love between the siblings and the family, and hopefully that kind of rises to the surface.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And they do find their way forward, right? So not to give anything away, but there is a sense of hope to it as well. So
yay, hope.
So the whole book does center around this Gordon family's second home on Wellfleet on Cape Cod. And it's a place important enough to sort of almost tear this family apart, which is quite a sway for a building to have, right? When we think of a building, it's just sticks and wood and some cement. But it's often so much more. And I guess I'm curious of what home means to you, the author. I mean, this is kind of a meditation about home and building a home. And I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
That's such a great question. And actually, when I taught at Beloit College, one of the classes I would teach was a class called Home. So I would assign my students lots of essays about home. So it's something that I think about a lot. And I think I especially thought about home when my kids were young and I led this kind of domestic life that didn't naturally feel very easy for me. I think most people probably feel that way, but I don't like to cook. I don't really like to have housework to do, although I do like having a kind of neat house. And I think that I struggle a little bit with what a house means and the kind of burden that a house imposes, but yet the necessity of a home and the fact that a home, like one of the characters observes, is like it's a container to hold all your memories. And so when a home passes hands from one generation to the next or different owners, it feels kind of like an abrupt rupture, or a violation of the rules and systems of order that you have in a house that people adhere to. Even with COVID, it's interesting how we move around our house. I thought it'd be kind of interesting to write a play based in our kitchen, because I think I've been paying attention to how we all use the kitchen as a touchstone. As the day goes on, we all do our own thing, all of us in our family, because we're all home now. And then we go off into our different spaces, and we know whose space is whose and how they occupy it. So houses do definitely impose order. And they also have a sort of power dynamic. Like social anthropologists talk about how in a home, it regulates us. There are certain rules that we have to follow about when you do things and why you do things and which rooms you do things in. And that kind of keeps the social order in place. So I think that's something maybe that I was thinking about as I was working on my book, because we have two homes. The home that is ostensibly set aside for a different purpose than a daily home. The characters, when they're in a second home, they're freed from a lot of the domestic burden. It's meant to be a place of leisure. And I think those are the reasons why we're so nostalgic about second homes, because it's where we spend our best time with each other. We can play games, we can play jigsaw puzzles. These are all ideas that I thought would be really quaint to readers when I was working on the book. And now everyone is reading this at a time when they've been doing jigsaw puzzles and playing every game in their cabinet. And then our house is much more, we're much more laden with responsibility there. We have to do laundry. We have to clean the toilets. I mean, not that you don't clean the toilet in your summer home, but, there's just like certain things you need to do that are more work-oriented.
That's really an interesting way to put it. And I, as you were talking, I was thinking about over Memorial Day, we spent the weekend with my sister and her family. Our kids are about the same age. They haven't played with anyone else for, since all of this started. And she has a pool, thank goodness. So we were able to get kids in the pool while it was so hot. But it was really interesting because we've gone on vacation before and we've gone to my parents' house before. But to be for that kind of time in someone else's home is interesting, because they have their own ways of doing things. They have their own sections of the home that they like to do. And especially now when everyone's at home working, it's just that order is different in everyone's home. And it's just, I never really actually stopped to think about it until you just said that. And it was very akin to the experience I just had.
Yeah, I think that's why when you go to someone's house for a while, as nice as it is to stay with friends, when you come home, it's so refreshing because you've got everything set up the way you want it. You know, it's your rules, your order, your routine that you're used to.
Yeah, absolutely. So what, other than this idea of kind of a home being, and especially a second home, what you also just said about a second home is it's where you go to kind of not necessarily shirk responsibility, but to do the things that you don't necessarily do in your day-to-day life. What else about this book do you want readers to kind of take with them as they turn that last page? What's your hope as a writer for that?
I think it's something that I take from my own life. From when my grandparents passed away, my aunts and my mom had to figure out the house. And I'll never forget this. My mom and I were driving around while they were working on all the funeral arrangements and everything. And my mom said, it's really frightening when you become the next generation, the next oldest generation, because without your parents there, you have to decide whether you want to stay a family. And that blew me away. I'd never thought that was a decision you had to make. I just thought family was always family. And it stayed with me. It stays with me all the time. I am the person in our family who organizes the family reunions, and I try to touch base with all my cousins. I have a small family, so it's kind of easy for me to stay in touch with everyone. But you just realize that's a decision you have to make. You have to be purposeful about staying a family, because it's really easy to fall apart. It's really, especially families these days, we're not all in the same city. We don't have that same kind of regular touch with each other. So I hope readers will read it and think, even if they don't have a healthy family to hold together, maybe trying to assemble a different kind of family with close friends, with people who understand you for your flaws and who know your story. And not just people who you're kind of born into.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that really, what you said just hit me right here. That I think that's something I'm going to carry forward now too. Just this idea that you choose if you want to stay a family. I again never thought about it that way before, but it's really
now I'm trying to impart that on my own children. We'll see how that goes.
I'm sure that they will be well connected. I know that for me, when I'm writing a book, there are always parts of them that I struggle with, no matter how much time I spend with them. And, it varies from book to book. But I'm really curious about kind of your revision process with this book, or were there any parts of this book that you really had to hone in on with revision, or what the revision process was like for you, or kind of how it maybe changed from originally when you told that story to yourself to when you told it to the readers?
Well, there are two places that come to mind. One is, as you know, there's a character who's really evil and who causes all the trouble. And I don't want to reveal what happens. But when I was working on that scene where he's manipulating everybody, I realized I'm really not a very naturally manipulative person. Like, I just couldn't wrap my brain around how he would do it. So I came up with all these different ways it would work, and the way the conversations would go, and the ways he would try to lie and get the characters to do what he wanted. And I could never remember. I was like, wait, what did I do last time? I knew I needed to get through that knot. And when I think of that section in the book, for a long time, it felt like a pretzel knot, right in the middle of the book. And I really struggled with it. And not until I went through multiple drafts did I kind of smooth it out and figure it out so that I could remember, okay, this is exactly what was said. This is how it worked. And it was an important part of the book, because the reader needs to believe that the characters would really fall for that. And so I needed to make sure I did it right. And so it was hard to write, but to get myself in that mindset of this character and what he's thinking, to do whatever it takes to preserve his family. So that was a part that was really sticky for me. And I was happy when that part was kind of worked out. And also the other scene where he's doing something really bad. So I don't want to say too much about it. But then the other thing that was really fun, and I don't know if you've ever done this with your writing, but when I sold the book, my editor was really excited about it. We had our first conversation. And she said, before I send you line edits or anything, I just thought the last third of the book could use a few more surprises. And I don't know why. You'd think like a writer would know like how much readers love surprises. And surprises, But I had the best time going back, because by then I knew the story, I knew the characters, and I thought, oh, what if this happens? And then they would start surprising me. The characters would just have a mind of their own at that point, because I was so deep into the narrative. And that was the most fun I ever had writing. It was really great. And with my second book, I remembered that. I was like, oh, I need to surprise readers. And so I would just open myself up, not just to surprise readers, but to surprise myself, to give my characters a little time to to say something or do something. I'm thinking about a scene in my second book right away where I was typing, and literally I was like, oh, So it's so funny when you gasp at your own work, at your own plot. You're like, who are these characters? How does this happen? That's the magic of writing.
It is. I love seeing your face light up over it too, because it's just, it is the most fun when you can kind of get into that place where your book surprises you.
Yeah.
And then surprises you. So I know you said you just put the finishing touches on your second book. Can you talk a little bit, so you've been writing quite a bit lately. Can you talk a little bit about what your process is? How do you write? Do you go in fits and spurts? Do you have a certain area of the house that you write in? What does that look like for you?
Like, I always love this question when I'm at readings, because I go to a lot of author readings, and I love how whenever the person asks this question, I know you're not asking this as a writer yourself because but I think a lot of times readers ask this question because they want you to tell them that it's really easy. Like, oh, I just wake up in the morning and I write for 4 hours, and then 2 months later it's done, and it's just so hard. It's the hardest process. And there are times when I walk around with my laptop just feeling like I want to throw it out of a window, so I wish I could say it's easy. But I tend to write in fits and spurts. I tend to write when I'm feeling a little bit more inspired. And that changed a little bit with the second book because I had a deadline. I had to get it done. And that was probably really good for me. It gave me a little more discipline to really feel like a worker, like this is my job. I need to sit down and work on it. But I tend to be very productive in spaces where there's a lot of light. So I'm not a person who, I know a lot of people say they like going into a basement or some like dark cave to write, but that's not me at all. I write really well in rooms that have a lot of lights. And in fact, the room I'm in right now has a lot of windows, and I find it a very like calming, productive space for me. And I tend to need to have a big chunk of time when I write. I'm not one of those people who can just write for 20 minutes, unless I'm editing. Like editing I can do in spurts. But I feel like so much of writing, even when you're not actively writing, you're writing. If I say, okay, for the next 4 hours, I'm going to go in this space and I'm going to really try to get some work done, I might spend the first hour just like meditating or like doing some yoga or procrastinating somehow. But really in my head, I'm thinking about the characters and what I want to do and what I want to accomplish. So then when I sit down, I'm kind of more in that space. The other thing I do when I write is I always read back. So if I'm reading a section, I know a lot of people say it's good to finish when you're writing, to finish on an open spot, like to not close out a narrative question before you finish so that it makes you want to write and answer, like get back into that space. I do that a little bit, but I always go back and read several pages to get back into the voice and the rhythm of my language, and to feel like I'm immersed in that narrative world that I'm building. And I think that's so important, is to just get lost in the writing. And I found this kind of magic happen with my second book. It happened with the first book too. When I got deep enough into it, when I was working and revising, I felt like I was in it with my characters. And when I'd go to sleep at night, I'd go to sleep thinking about them, and I'd wake up thinking about them. And the story was like inside of me. And I just had to get it down. And that's so wonderful when that happens. But it's not like that at the beginning usually, because you're making so many decisions and you're kind of plotting through. So you have to be willing to get through that hard first part before you can kind of get to the second part. So there's different, it's not like writing is the same every day. I think my writing is really different depending on which stage of the manuscript I'm tackling.
Yeah, I think that that's very much true for me too. Yeah, for
Uh-huh.
sure. And are you kind of a morning writer? Are you a afternoon writer? Are you right at night when the house is quiet? I mean, probably not at night if you like natural light, but
Yeah, I'm definitely not a night writer.
no.
By nighttime, my brain is just completely scrambled eggs. You know, like I can't think. I'm definitely a morning writer.
Okay.
I wake up pretty early, and the bad thing though is I also like to run or exercise because I kind of like feel guilty if I don't as the day goes on. So it's kind of like I'm always trying to manage in the morning, like, oh, should I work out or should I write? You know, and in the summer now I have to work out first because it's going to be so hot, you know, so I'll have to go for my run first. But
Yeah, that's exactly the
afternoons,
dilemma. Go ahead.
pardon me.
That's exactly the same dilemma that I usually face. Like, okay, do I work
Yeah.
out? Do I write? Do I work out? Do I write? Like, which,
Yeah,
sometimes
I
it's
always want,
time to do both, at least for me.
yeah, I definitely want to pack a lot in the mornings.
Hmm. Makes sense. That makes sense. So I know you just put those so important words, the end, on your second project. And I'm wondering if, since it's finished, if you would be willing to kind of give a little preview and talk a little bit about it.
Sure. Well, it might sound like a departure from the second home, but actually my editor sent me a really nice email after she finished the manuscript, and she said, there is a through line between both books, and it feels like a Christina Clancy novel. So I was so happy when I heard that. But the second book, get ready, is set in the old Playboy Resort in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And it closed in 1981. And I've always thought it was so interesting that a town as small as Lake Geneva was the home to Hugh Hefner's enterprise. And that these women who worked there, I started interviewing former bunnies, who, by the way, are the best. I have like all these great new friends who are former bunnies, but they had these really wonderful experiences working as Playboy bunnies. And they had the best time, and they learned how to kind of get in touch with their sexuality and their confidence. And it kind of went against what I thought Playboy bunnies were. And I really approached the novel thinking, I'm not coming for or against Playboy. I just want to hear their stories, and I just want to write my own story. So when it came time for me to write my story, it's set mostly in East Troy, which is a town next to Lake Geneva. And it's also the home of Alpine Valley. And it's just down the road a piece, as they say, in East Troy, from the Grand Geneva Resort, which is what the Playboy Mansion used to be, or Playboy Resort used to be. So, but it was a family resort. And the women, when they were hired, they would be told that they're Wisconsin cute or Wisconsin beautiful, which I think is so interesting, and so they just had to be pretty enough. And really they were hired on personality, because they needed to be outgoing and friendly and to make everyone feel good when they were at the resort. And they were beautiful. A lot of all the women I've talked to have been gorgeous, but they were also, it was a family resort. So they would supervise Easter egg hunts. I heard stories about nuns teaching or about Playboy bunnies teaching nuns how to ski. So it's definitely not what we think of when we think of Playboy, which makes it really fun. I think any topic that you can approach that's a little different than what people think makes for good writing. So I had the best time writing it. And it's about my character, Sherry Taylor, who I feel is like my friend now. I just love her. She was really fun to write about. So I'm super excited. I think it comes out next summer, but I don't know when.
Okay. Do you have a title yet?
Well, the title right now is called Shoulder Season.
Okay.
But I don't know if it'll stay the title.
Might change.
I love it. I hope it does.
Yeah, that's a fantastic title. And what an fascinating history. I never knew that about the Grand Geneva Resort. And I had no idea. So it sounds like you had to do quite a bit of research too then, or a lot of interviews and.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting when you're talking about the writing process, how my other book, I needed to do some research. Like I learned how to surf, and I spent a lot of time in Cape Cod in the off season, and I talked to estate planners and real estate agents. For the Playboy Bunny book, I had to talk to a lot of different people who had worked at the resort and part of the Playboy Empire, and the people who went as guests, you know, who had saved things. They're so nostalgic about that. They still have their Playboy keys. They're like, this is going to be buried with me, my Playboy key that they had. So it invigorates my writing. You know, sometimes I'll feel a little stuck, and then I'll talk to someone and they'll tell me a story, and suddenly I'll have this amazing detail that I'm like, I've got to get this in the book. You know, this has got to be really important. So, but it's very much like my other book, where it's really a book about place. Mm-hmm. You know, about these characters who, I mean, I just try to think, what was it like for people in East Troy to live so close to where Sonny and Cher were hanging out, and famous golfers, and Gabe Kaplan would perform, you know, and they had a boxing arena, and, you know, it's just so fascinating.
Well, and I feel like that's a through line too, right? You have this sort of perception or this kind of surface level kind of glamour, and then the, you know, kind of what happens behind the scenes to the people who work in these communities and keep them going. And I love that juxtaposition. I think it's fascinating. But
yeah, I think that's why Cape Cod is the way I portrayed it. You know, it's not a wealthy family mm-hmm. with a fancy summer home that can afford, you know, the parents have to make great sacrifices to be teachers so that they can have their summers off. The family's very middle class. When they adopt Michael, it puts strain on their finances. And later on, even when the characters go back to Cape Cod, like Poppy, when she learns how to be an oysterer, like she becomes part of the community and she has to make a living the way everybody else does. And there's also all these tensions in resort communities that we saw writ large during the COVID crisis, when people from New York especially wanted to go to Cape Cod or these other vacation communities, and they didn't want them. Mm-hmm. You know, they're like, stay away. You know, so that there are these rifts, and I wanted to explore that because I think that's a really interesting line of tension.
I do too, and it comes through loud and clear in the second home, and I can't wait to read about it in your next one too.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and you sort of glossed over something that you just said, though, that you learned to surf to research.
But
that's amazing.
The problem is the water in Cape Cod is really cold in the backshore. Like even in the middle of summer, it's really cold. But the best waves are in the winter. So a lot of true surfers in Cape Cod surf in the winter because that's when the surf is good. So I had to learn how to surf in the summer when the waves weren't great. But I got up my first time, which was so exciting. And then right as I was kind of getting the surfing bug, there were sharks in the back shore. I don't know if you've seen some of the news reports about sharks. It's a big thing now. If you go to Cape Cod, on all the beaches, they have these really scary signs that look like billboards for Jaws, the movie. And so it keeps me out of the water. I go to the ponds instead. So for now, my surfing life is over, but I hope I can surf in another place where there's real waves. People surf in Lake Michigan.
Yes. Yeah. And even Superior. I lived near Lake Superior for a while, and they would surf in the middle of the winter there, which was always amazing to me.
And speaking of cold water, Lake Superior is freezing.
It's freezing all the time too. So that's amazing. I love hearing all about like different elements of research that go into people's books. But you know, that part of it, I've got to say those sections especially rang so true to me. Not that I surf, but it just, the details, I was like, she has to be a surfer because, you know, how else would she know all of this? And so they really, you know, Poppy sections when she was kind of being taken in by the surf community and learning to do that, it really drew me in. So
Yeah, Poppy was definitely she required the most research and she was the most fun to research. We were actually in Hawaii on the North Shore and I met this woman named Erin Aquarius and she was just like Poppy. She traveled all over and that section where we talk about Poppy's travels, that a lot of that was based on the information that this woman told me. And it was so fascinating. But you know, but I'm sure you've experienced this when you write. When you ask people about their professions or the things that they know a lot about or their histories, whether it's Playboy bunnies or surfers or real estate lawyers or estate planners, they love telling you about their jobs. They're proud of their knowledge and they're happy you asked usually. And I think some of those connections I make with people when I'm working on a novel make the process so much less lonely too. So.
That's a great way to think about it. I mean, that research is almost like a community building
totally
activity
Absolutely.
For writers. Yeah.
And now that the book's out in the world, it's like community building all over again with bookstores. You know, like Arcadia Books, I'd been there so many times before, but they didn't know me as a writer. They knew me as someone who ordered a latte and bought a book, you know, and they've been so fantastic through this whole process. I love going into the store and now I know the booksellers and I was at a reception with the owner and doing this for Arcadia is so cool. So it's nice to have that. Now I'm on the other end, you know, where I get my community built by being part of a bookstore world, and booksellers are the best.
They absolutely are. And, you know, when you were saying that you love like sunlit spaces and everything, like every time I think of Arcadia, we can't be there today, obviously, but I think of that, the wood floors and the sun pouring in, and it's just such a magical store run by amazing people. So
yeah, it's like the beating heart of the community.
Mm-hmm. So many bookstores, right?
Yeah.
Really are. So, well, Christy, this has just been so much fun. And I'm so
thank
happy
you, Erin.
This is a wonderful, wonderful book. It is an amazing read. And I'm just really honored to have been able to sit and chat with you about it and kind of get some more information about the rest of the story.
Oh, thanks. I'm honored you took the time. Thank you.